friends, welcome back to DigiTalk. And in this session, I am going to cover a very important topic that is specifically related with the transactions in Weblogic. And I saw many engineers get confused around this topic most of the times. Okay, so what I'm going to cover is about the transactions in the Weblogic. What are the transaction logs or the TLOGs? Okay, and what is the use and working of the transaction manager and source manager, the default TLOG store, and the database based TLOG store, that means the transaction logs, which is based on the database. Okay. And apart from that, how the transactions get recovered in case of a failure of a particular server. Okay. Or maybe if you are going to force shut down a server, how the transactions get recovered after the restart. Okay, and along with that, what exactly is a two-phase commit? So there are multiple topics, but they all are related with each other. So I'm going to explain you every topic in a very simple and plain language with very basic examples, so that you will get a complete understanding of each and every topic. Okay, so first let us discuss about transaction, distributed transaction, XA, transaction manager, and resource manager. Okay, so now if I talk about what is the definition of a transaction. Okay, so we all do a lot of transactions in our daily life. For example, if you're going for a certain kind of a shopping on any e-commerce website, then when you purchase a particular product, then we do a transaction, right? And apart from that, when we log into our net banking website of the bank or any financial institutes, we do a lot of transactions there as well. Okay, so now there are a lot of processes are involved in the transactions, or you can say there are a lot of multiple operations involved in a single transaction. Okay, so transaction is a group of operation as a single unit of work. For example, when you transfer money from bank account, then there are two operations. One is the debit money from one account. That means if you're, it has to be debit from your account, and then credit money to the second account. Okay, where exactly you are going to credit the money. So now these two operations and both treated as one single transaction. So that means it looks like a single transactions, but what we are doing it, we are debiting the money from one account and then we are crediting the money to the second account, right? So now there could be two different bank, or there could be two different financial institutes. They have their own applications, they have their own database, right? So that means you will have a two database. One is of the source bank and second is of the target bank, right? So when we are doing the transactions, both of the database need to be updated at the same time. Okay, so that means it looks like a single transactions, but inside a single transaction, there are different kind of operations. Okay, so now what exactly is a distributed transaction, which is also called the global transaction? It is a group of operations as part of a single transaction that span across two or more data sources or data stores, like the database. It could be messaging queue, or it could be any other data sources. Okay, which is on same, which could be on the same or on the different host, right? So this kind of a transaction where we have a multiple operations are involved in a single transaction, it is also called a distributed transaction, or also called as a global transaction. Okay, where we are updating the multiple data sources at the same time. So in the previous example, as I said, we have a two banks involved in the transactions. So that means we have a two database involved in that particular distributed or the global transactions. Okay, and we have a two data source there. The first one is the database of bank one, source bank, and second is the database of bank two. Okay, so this is also called the global transaction or the distributed transactions. Now there is another term which is called XA, which is a extended architecture, and you must have seen this when you have configured a data source. Then you will see the certain kind of a driver as a XA. Okay, and now XA. So XA is a standard for executing the global transactions. Okay, that means whatever we have discussed so far about the transactions and the multiple operations that have been involved in a single transaction, which is called a distributed transactions. So all these functionalities and feature is provided by the XA standard, which is called the extended architecture. Okay, so this XA is support the distributed transactions, or also called the global transactions, which involve the accessing the multiple backend data sources at the same time. Either you are going to read, or either you are going to update, delete, add. Okay, so that means you are updating with the multiple data store in the backend. Okay, and that features is provided with the help of XA standards. Okay, so now apart from that, we have two terms that involve in this kind of a distributed transaction. One is called the transaction manager, and second is called the resource manager. So it's a very straightforward. If we are talking about a WebLogic server, okay, where our applications are deployed, and then these distributed transactions are executing in our from our WebLogic server. Okay, then this WebLogic server will act as a transaction manager, which will completely own or handle end to end the global transaction or the global transactions, whatever executing in your uh, database using the WebLogic server. So in a nutshell, you can say your WebLogic server will act as a transaction manager because it is going to manage the transactions. And second is your resource manager. So all of the backend data stores, those are participating in that particular transaction is referred as a resource manager. Okay, so for example, if I again take the example, the first example where we are going to debit the money from one account and then we are going to credit the money to the second account, we are doing a certain kind of a money transfer. So in that case, your WebLogic server will act as a transaction manager, and you have a two backend database of the bank one and bank two. So both data sources or the both database will act as a resource manager. Okay, so this is called the transaction manager and resource manager. And when there is a global transaction is executing, then your transaction manager and resource manager play a very critical role in that case, because the information from the transfer transaction manager is passed to your resource manager for the commit of the operations or for the rollback of the operations. Okay. So let us discuss about two-phase commit and the WebLogic JDA configuration. So now two-phase commit, you must have heard about that one, which is also called a 2PC. So two-phase commit protocol coordinate all the processes that participate in a global distributed transaction to commit or roll back the transaction. So what happens is that if we are doing a certain kind of a transactions and which involve the multiple operations, okay, so it could appear as a single transactions, but in the backend there could be multiple operations, right? So that means all the operations in combine making a single transactions. So when the transaction is executing, either this transaction has to be successfully completed or it has to be rolled back. Okay, so when I'm saying that it has to be completed successfully, that means all of the data stored in the backend participating in the transaction has to commit the data at the same time. Or if you are going to roll back the transaction, that means if any of the backend database is not available, then complete transactions need to be rolled back. Okay, so let me go back to my previous example and let me explain you again. So in the first example wherein we were doing the money transfer, okay, so this transaction involved the debit money from the one account and credit to the another account, right? So suppose that because they both are belong to a different database of different banks, okay, so suppose that your money has been debited from your account, and but it has not been credited to the other account because maybe that database is not up and running at that time. So that means that transaction need to be rolled back. That means the money that has been debited from your account, it has to be credited back again, right? So if the both of the transactions are successful, that means the debit is successful and the credit is also successful, that the transaction will mark as a completed. But if any one of the operations that are involved in the transactions, global transactions, it get failed, that complete transaction need to be rolled back. Or you can say the complete all of the operation involved in a single transactions need to be rolled back. Okay, and this is happened or this is done with the help of two-phase commit protocol. So two-phase commit protocol use two steps to commit changes in the global or the distributed transaction. So now, because it is called the two-phase commit, so there are two phases in the 2PC protocol. The first one is the TM or the transaction manager asks resource manager to prepare for changes. Okay, and then if all RMs, that means all resource managers report that they are ready to commit, transaction manager asks resource manager to commit that make changes permanent. If any resource manager is not ready to commit, then transaction manager tell to all RMs to roll back. This is exactly in line with the example that I have explained just some time back. Okay, so now in our example where we were doing the transfer of money, in the first phase, during the transfer of money, transaction manager asks resource manager to prepare for changes. So now we have in example, we have two resource manager, the database of the bank one and the database of bank two. So now your transaction manager, which is the WebLogic server, in the phase one will ask resource manager to prepare for the changes. That means, okay, now I have debited the money from from the bank one, or I am going to debit the money from the bank one, and immediately once I will debit the money from bank one, you have to commit the changes in both of the database after credit in the second account. That means the both operation has to be committed at the same time. So be ready for that one. Okay, so in the first phase, it is just a prepare for changes. That means the transaction manager will ask the resource manager to be ready to commit the changes in all of the databases at the same time. Okay, be ready for that one. And in second case, resource manager report that they are ready to commit. Transaction manager asks a resource manager to commit that make changes permanent. So in second phase, the all of the resource manager will respond that okay, we are ready for the changes. And once your phase one is completed and you have received the successful response, that means your transaction manager has received the successful response from the backend, all of the backend resource managers. Okay, then it asks for the resource manager, okay, do and go for the commit. If it will not receive the response from any one of the resource manager in the phase one, then it will ask all of the resource manager to roll back the changes. Okay, so this is called the two-phase commit. So WebLogic server implement JTA, which is called Java Transaction API to manage transactions. Okay, so in WebLogic server, when we implement the JTA, which is called the Java Transaction API, which is used for the management of the global transactions or the distributed transactions. So WebLogic server can act as a transaction manager to the various transaction resource managers in distributed global transactions. As I said, in that case, your WebLogic server will act as a transaction manager, and all of the backend data sources, those are involved in the multiple operations inside a single transaction. All of the data sources will act as a resource manager. Okay, and as WebLogic server manages global transaction, it tracks transaction in binary transaction log called as a TLOG, which is called a transaction log. So this is a very important point. All of the transactions, all of the global or the distributed transactions, information has been logged in a binary transaction log file. Okay, that means it will be a .dat file. Okay, and all the logs will be captured in that transaction log. Now this transaction log can be a file system based or it can be a database. That means you can save the transaction log either at the file system level or at the database level. The default is the file system level. Okay, so I will tell you where is the location and then how to configure the database level your transaction logs if you would like to change that. Okay, and another important point is that when we say about that the server is get crash or maybe you are force shut down the server are going to restart that one, that means your transaction will get on hold, okay, at that time, and then it will reinitiate it when your server is restarted. And this reinitiation of the transactions after the restart it happen with the help of transaction log. That means this transaction log completely store the information about all of the transactions and their states when the server get crash or maybe when you force down the server, the every information, that means the every state of the transaction of each and every transaction that has are in process at that particular moment will be stored in the transaction logs. And once your server is restarted, again your server will read the transaction log and it will initiate the transactions though they get stuck when your server get crash or when you have shut down the server. So now how to configure the JTA in WebLogic? So to configure the JTA in WebLogic server, you have to go to the WebLogic console and then click on your domain name and then you click on the configuration tab and then you will get a sub tab which is called JTA. Click on the JTA and then you will see the lot of configurations with respect to the JTA. The first one is the very important configuration which is called the timeout seconds. The other parameters are optional and they may be come with the proper default value. You may don't need to change the other parameters, but the timeout second is a very important parameter. And this parameter depicts the transaction that it is a time that transaction manager wait for new transaction to go into prepared state. That means whenever a distributed transaction is executed from your transaction manager. So as I said, there will be a phase one and phase two in the two phase commit, right? So phase one is when your transaction manager asks for each and every resource manager to be ready or prepared for the commit of the data that is coming in the transaction, right? So this timeout is specifically related with the phase one of the two phase commit. Okay, that means if your transaction manager is coordinating with all of the resource manager to make them prepare for the phase one, if any of the resource manager is not responded or not responding, then it will wait for this particular timeout second. And if and it will not get the response from any one of the resource manager, then it will roll back the transaction, complete transaction. And that's why I said it is very important to configure this value. The default value is 30 seconds, which is small. And this need to be configured based on the expected number of transactions and the expected timing for the completion of the transactions. Okay, for certain applications, there could be a requirement that transaction has to be completed within few seconds. Okay, for that 30 seconds would be sufficient. But if we have a certain long running transaction, specifically when you're running certain batch jobs which get executed in a database and then which create the huge load at a particular moment when the batch jobs get run, and then it is expected that your response will get delayed from the database. So for that one, you have to increase the value of this timeout second. Otherwise, what will happen is that your transaction will get submitted to the database, and there could be a chance that the expected completion time of the database query which has been fired, which may be more than 60 seconds or maybe 2 minutes or maybe 30 minutes, or could be I have seen that many clients with this, the value for this is more than 1 hour. Okay, where they have been running the multiple batch jobs. So if it is expected that your job will take longer time and you have configured the less value for this particular timeout, then your transaction will get timed out in between. Okay, and apart from that, you will have abundant timeout second. The time, this is the timeout for the second phase in the distributed transaction. Similarly, you have maximum transactions, the maximum number of concurrent transactions that is allowed on the server. Similarly, you have max unique name statistics. That means the whenever a distributed transaction is executed, there is a name, a unique name is assigned for each and every transactions. This is the maximum number of unique names that is assigned for the transaction, and this value is derived from the max transactions. Okay, and then you have a checkpoint interval second. That means this is the frequency at which transaction manager create a transaction log and check to see if the old logs can be deleted, which is based on the policy that you have configured. Okay, and this is the checkpoint interval when your transaction logs get created or updated. Okay, so now we have a complete clarity on TLOG. So during transaction, server write to binary transaction log file called TLOG file. Each WebLogic server has transaction log that record information about propagation of transaction through system. So that means every transaction is getting logged in the transaction log so that it can be recovered in case your server get crash or you have forced down your server. So if WebLogic server fails, when server is restarted, it read its transaction log and recover the transactions. Okay, and to configure the transaction or the TLOGS, okay, you have to go to the servers, then click on your server name. Okay, so this you have to configure this for each and every server. Okay, so you have to click on your server name. In the screenshot you can see the server name is SOA server 1. Click on the configuration tab and then services. Inside services you have to click on the advanced, and there you can see the type. The default is a default store. That means the default file store type for the global transactions or for the transaction log is the file store case. That means the information will be stored in the file system. Okay. And apart from that, the second important information configuration that you can see the data source. Data source is required only when you are going to configure the database-based transaction logs. Okay. And the prefix name, this is the name for the table that will get created in the database. Okay, when we configure the database based transaction logs. Okay, so this is the location where I said we have to go to servers and then server name, click on server, your server name, then configuration services, and then you can click on the transaction logs tool inside the advanced option. Okay, now the default location of transaction log is inside your server staging directory. Okay, that means inside the domain you will have a folder called servers. Inside the servers we have the different folders with the name of each and every server. Okay, inside each and every server, you will have a folder called data. Inside data, you will have a folder called store, and inside store, you will have a folder called default. So this is the default location of the transaction log. Okay, by default, that means by default, your all the transaction log will get stored inside this particular directory. Okay, with a file name with .dat. Why .dat? Because this is a binary file. Okay, and to change the directory location, if you would like to change the location of the directory, okay, because if you can see on the screen, the directory option is empty. There is no path in the directory because by default it is taking the directory which is inside the domain, which I just explained. If you would like to change the location of the directory tlog, then you can update in the directory tab or the directory option inside the same, which is displaying on the screen. Okay, and for transaction recovery, that is for servers in cluster, you must store transaction log in a shared location or in a database so that transaction logs are available to backup services. That means if you are going to configure the failover, for your transactions. That means if your one of your server is get crashed, so that other servers or the backup servers can take that request. Okay, that means for that you have to make sure this directory is a shared location, because that file need to be accessed by the all of the servers, right? Or you can configure the database level transaction store so that the all servers can access the tables. Okay. Now, to if you would like to configure the database-based TLOGS instead of a default, which is file-based, so for that, first you have to create the data source. Why we're creating the data source? Because our data transactions logs are going to be stored in the database. To access the database, we have to configure the data source. So first you can configure a data source. Okay, and when you are configuring the data source, make sure do not use the XJDBC driver. Okay, and then select the driver which is called Oracle driver thin for instance connections. There are a lot of drivers when we configure a data source. Then we get a lot of different kind of a drivers, right? So in that selection, you have to select the option Oracle driver thin for instance connection. Select this driver. Okay, and once you have configured the data source, then you have to configure the data source based transaction log. For that, you have to go to the servers inside the environments, click on your server name, configuration services, which we have seen in the previous slide as well. Okay, then in the type, you have to select the JDBC, right? The default is a default store. You have to change it to JDBC, and then you have to select your data source that you have created inside the data source, right? And after that, you have to give the prefix name. So prefix is automatically assigned to the table which is going to be created in the database for storing the transaction log. So by default, the table will be created with the name of WL store, and whatever the prefix that you will define inside the prefix table, prefix section, okay, it will get appended to the WL store. For example, in the previous screen, if I go to previous screen and show you the default value of the prefix, which is tlog underscore server SOA underscore server 1. So tlog it will take by default, and SOA server 1 it will automatically take the name of your managed server. Okay, so this is the recommended prefix for your table, right? So now in this case, our table will get created with the name of uh, let me go back and see, right? Tlog underscore SOA underscore server underscore 1, and then WL store, right? And you have to configure this particular configuration for each and every server. So now what will happen is that you will have a multiple TLOG database tables in the database, one for each and every server. So for server 1, it by default taken the prefix as tlog underscore SOA underscore server 1. Similarly, if you go for the configuration of the tlog for the server 2, right, you can select the same data source. Okay, but the prefix it will automatically take as a tlog underscore the name of your second server. This is to make a differentiate in the table between in the database for each and every transaction log for each and every server, right? And throughput for TLOG is better for file-based repository compared to database. If you look for the throughput, okay, that means the execution of the transaction executing per second. Okay, that is called the throughput for TLOG. It is better for file system based instead compared to the database repository. Okay, and now if you would like to monitor the transactions, whatever how many transactions are executing in your system, how many transactions are committed, how many transactions are rolled back. So for that, you go to your servers, click on server name, click on monitoring tab, then JTA, and then click on summary. And here you can see the total number of transactions that have been executed on this particular server since last restart of the server, then the total number of committed transactions, rollback transactions, and apart from that, you will have a multiple tabs are there, and you can get multiple information with respect to the distributed transactions, right? So this is all about the distributed transactions and the transactions failures and recovery. Thank you.